Alright, so as an amateur video creator and thinker, I've decided it would be best to make my first video on a topic that is simple and uncontroversial. So accordingly, today I will be talking about religion, atheism, and the meaning of life. Now, sarcasm aside, this is clearly just my perspective, which is very subject to criticism, and that criticism is encouraged and appreciated, although a respectful conversation would be most beneficial for everyone involved. I'm not here as a prophet to give you insight into the meaning of life, but merely to lay out some questions and some thoughts that have been bouncing around my mind. And I hope that they might offer a new and intriguing insight into the topic, although I, like anyone else, has been shaped by the people and ideas that I've listened to. Now, with that mess out of the way, I've chosen today to examine and elaborate on the ideas that are presented in Kurzgesagt's video entitled Optimistic Nihilism, which I think is a fantastic addition to their excellent body of work that you should go watch, by the way. And this video ultimately covers the philosophy which they are grounded upon. Now, there are two philosophies which we'll be examining today: existential nihilism and optimistic nihilism, the latter of which being the kind presented by Kurzgesagt in their video. To begin, I believe it would be important to understand what exactly essential nihilism is. And according to the epicenter of truth and understanding, Wikipedia defines it as the philosophical theory that life has no intrinsic meaning or value. With respect to the universe, existential nihilism suggests that a single human, or even the entire human species, is insignificant, without purpose, and unlikely to change in the totality of existence. Sounds like a bummer, doesn't it? Well, there are numerous important philosophers who have spoken extensively on the subject of existentialism and nihilism, particularly the likes of Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, and Nietzsche. However, you're here listening to me, a random guy on YouTube, and I like to talk. So, a few questions must be asked. How do you get to a place of existential nihilism? Is it possible to combat the dread that accompanies it? And if so, how can one find meaning if it has not been intrinsically placed upon their life? Firstly, existential nihilism is a position held by a relative minority of people, particularly being rejected by the mass majority of those with religious affiliation, who often argue that this philosophical mindset would be a necessary or logical conclusion after asserting the absence of a god. And I would immediately like to say that this conflation is not legitimate, as atheism is merely the non-acceptance of religious or deistic claims, due to a lack of reason or evidence. Therefore, to say that atheism has any bearing upon the question of life's purpose would be an almost nonsensical assertion. However, so as to not be obtuse, it seems to me that since atheism removes one of the most common, not necessarily correct, groundings for purpose, it can lead to nihilistic thoughts and ideas for some. So, although there might be some correlation between the two, neither is necessarily the cause of the other. Phew. Okay, so, as an important distinction that I would like to make before moving on to the second question, which I had mentioned earlier, I'd like to say exactly how Kurzgesagt seems to differ from the position of existential nihilists, and why. The thought process of the two philosophies seems to be similar, up until the final conclusion, where for existential nihilists, it seems to be as so. Life has no intrinsic purpose or meaning, therefore life has no purpose or meaning. However, Kurzgesagt seems to say a differing conclusion, instead proposing that life has no intrinsic purpose or meaning. However, purpose and meaning do not need to be intrinsic. Rather, it is possible to give yourself purpose and meaning in spite of the reductionist nature of the universe. Now, this might seem quite unsatisfying to a lot of people, as most have been brought up with a top-down understanding of the universe, particularly understanding meaning being a master plan set in place by God. Therefore, once this plan has been tossed out and meaning is no longer intrinsic, it seems as if there is no alternative. So, this leads directly into the second and third questions that I asked. Is it possible to combat the dread that accompanies the realizations of existential nihilism And if so, how can one find meaning if it has not been intrinsically placed upon their life? Kurzgesagt seems to argue an emphatic yes, and here's how. Purpose should not be defined as a top-down process. Rather, it is a bottom-up process that encourages people to choose how they will live their life, using their emotions, thoughts, behaviors, relationships, jobs, talents, and interests as a compass. Not necessarily leading to any one destination, but a massive gradient of possible desirable outcomes that can be achieved over the course of even a very short lifetime. Often, a top-down method of instruction is more comforting and easier to swallow. However, after some time and introspection, one might find that the freedom to choose is an entirely worthy and respectable alternative. Now, if anyone's particular purpose is just as valid as anyone else's, thereby being entirely subjective, then isn't this purpose entirely arbitrary and unfounded? Must there not be an absolute purpose with which to coincide with? Now, the best way I can refute these questions is to start with the idea of absolute purpose and determine whether this is even a legitimate idea in the first place. If you were asked what made you happy in life, it seems apparent that this would be entirely subjective to the individual, with an absolute happiness being an entirely strange and unattainable concept. You know when you're happy. You can feel it. You don't need an absolute happiness from which to compare your happiness to determine whether or not it's valid. You do not need an absolute beauty from which to determine what you subjectively deem beautiful. Therefore, in much the same way, you do not need an absolute purpose from which to determine what your subjective purpose is. And this notion doesn't even make sense to begin with. Now, even with Kurzgesagt's expression of purpose and how to attain it, two opposite but important questions often surface. Firstly, how do I escape the fear of my imminent death and eternal nothingness? I think Kurzgesagt puts it in the most simple and impactful way possible. Close your eyes. Count to 1. That's exactly how long forever feels. Death is scary, that's undeniable. Change is scary. We don't like it. But don't let fear overtake you. Your biological mechanisms will shut off, and that is how they will remain. But in that, there's no pain, no fear. It's the ultimate sleep. Now, the opposite question is for some even more inescapable and difficult to answer. If life is derived from the bottom up, and death is not something to be afraid of, then why continue to suffer? Why not just end it all? If this question in any way becomes a legitimate source of trouble, I would strongly recommend that you seek help from anyone whom you love. They're stuck with you here, and they want to help. Let them. Remember the things that used to make you happy, even if it's difficult. There is still reason. You just need to find it. In conclusion, what is the meaning of life? There's no one answer. It is your choice, even if it's a scary one to make. Who and what do you value? How do you demonstrate that value? You are not entirely under the control of life, so seize what you can and don't let go. This is your shot. Take it. Live.